By the winter of 1944, the German army was losing the war. But inside Allied headquarters, an uncomfortable truth surfaced, one that would never appear in official communiques. German generals were not planning against Allied strength. They were planning against fear, and that fear had a name. Not Montgomery, not Eisenhower, but George S. Patton.
The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was not panicking, but it was unsettled. At Versailles, Dwight D. Eisenhower reviewed fresh intelligence arriving faster than his staff could summarize it. Ultra decrypts, prisoner interrogations, captured German planning notes, different sources, same pattern. Wherever Patton's Third Army maneuvered, German armor followed. Not cautiously, not incrementally, but urgently. Panzer reserves were being repositioned again and again, often abandoning more heavily manned Allied sectors to face one American army in the South. This made no mathematical sense. Montgomery's forces in the North held more divisions, more armor, and more logistical priority. Yet German commanders behaved as if Patton were the decisive threat. Eisenhower understood numbers. He understood logistics. But what he was seeing now was psychology. The Germans were not responding to Allied mass. They were reacting to unpredictability. And that realization would soon force Eisenhower to confront a truth he could never admit publicly.
By late December, the evidence was overwhelming. Captured German documents showed contingency plans explicitly referencing Patton's operational tempo. Prisoners from multiple Wehrmacht units independently described Third Army as uncontrollable and impossible to anticipate. Ultra intercepts revealed panzer divisions held in reserve not against Montgomery's deliberate advances, but against Patton's potential movements. This was not admiration, it was fear. German generals trained in Prussian doctrine expected predictability, phased attacks, deliberate pauses, methodical consolidation. Montgomery fit that model perfectly. Patton did not. He attacked without waiting for ideal conditions, exploited gaps before orders could be rewritten, and advanced faster than German staff cycles could process. To German planners, Montgomery could be answered. Patton had to be anticipated. And anticipation is far harder than reaction. Eisenhower now faced a dangerous paradox. The most psychologically effective Allied weapon was also the most politically volatile. Using it openly risked shattering Allied unity. Ignoring it risked prolonging the war. It was during a quiet exchange with his chief of staff that Eisenhower finally spoke the words he would never allow into official history. According to post-war recollections, Eisenhower acknowledged what the intelligence already proved. German commanders were not afraid of Montgomery. This was not an insult, it was an assessment. Montgomery's caution, his preference for overwhelming force and long preparation, made him predictable. The Germans always had time to respond. Patton, by contrast, compressed decision-making. He forced errors. He forced panic. Eisenhower did not see Patton as a replacement for Montgomery. He saw him as a weapon, dangerous, unstable, but irreplaceable. And so Eisenhower did what his role demanded. He concealed the truth, balanced egos, redistributed resources in ways that appeared fair rather than optimal, and quietly learned to let German fear work for the Allies. What followed, through the Bulge, the Rhine, and into Germany, would prove that perception, not manpower, was shaping the final campaign.
but the cost of that balance would remain hidden for decades.
When the German Ardennes offensive erupted, it was intended to split the Allied front and force a negotiated peace. But beneath its operational goals lay a revealing anxiety. German planning assumed that Patton would react faster than Allied doctrine allowed. They were correct. Even before formal orders were issued, German intelligence reported unusual Third Army activity, fuel dumps repositioned, units reoriented south to north, command vehicles moving continuously. To German staff officers, this confirmed their worst assumption. Patton was already turning. Montgomery's response in the north was deliberate and stabilizing, exactly what Eisenhower needed politically. Patton's response was different. He compressed weeks of planning into days, executing a maneuver that German generals believed should have been impossible in winter conditions. The contrast mattered. German reserves continued to hedge against Patton's potential arrival rather than exploit slower Allied sectors. The Bulge did not collapse immediately, but it never achieved its decisive objective. Fear, not force, had already distorted German decision-making.
Eisenhower's role was never simply military, it was diplomatic. He understood that Allied victory depended as much on cohesion as on combat power. British confidence in Montgomery had to be preserved. American faith in Patton had to be restrained. Favoring one openly risked fracturing the alliance. This explains decisions that still provoke debate. Fuel allocations, supply prioritization, and operational pacing that appeared to slow Patton while enabling Montgomery's methodical advances. These were not endorsements of superiority, they were acts of balance. Eisenhower knew Patton could exploit momentum with fewer resources. Montgomery required overwhelming support to maintain pressure. The uncomfortable truth was that Eisenhower often compensated for perceived weakness rather than rewarding demonstrated effectiveness. German intelligence noticed this too. They did not fear Montgomery's schedule. They feared Patton breaking Eisenhower's restraints. And so they watched the southern sector obsessively, waiting for the move that might come without warning.
German generals were products of a doctrine that valued tempo, but only within controlled parameters. They respected speed they could calculate. They feared speed they could not. Montgomery's operations, including Market Garden earlier in 1944, reinforced German confidence that Allied offensives would pause, regroup, and announce themselves through buildup. Even failures could be exploited because they unfolded slowly. Patton shattered that expectation. His Third Army did not pause for perfection. It advanced when opportunities appeared and accepted calculated risk. This forced German commanders to overcommit reserves, reposition prematurely, and defend against attacks that had not yet materialized. The result was strategic exhaustion. German units moved constantly, burning fuel and time, reacting to a threat that might strike tomorrow or might already be underway. In warfare, uncertainty is corrosive. By December 1944, Patton represented uncertainty incarnate.
The ultimate validation of Eisenhower's insight came at the Rhine. While Montgomery prepared a meticulously staged crossing under overwhelming force, Patton crossed first, almost incidentally, near Oppenheim. There was no grand announcement, no pause, no ceremonial build-up. German defenses, already stretched thin anticipating Patton elsewhere, failed to respond in time. This was not recklessness, it was exploitation of psychological advantage. Patton crossed before German commanders believed he would be allowed to. Montgomery's crossing followed with massive resources and global attention. Patton's succeeded because the enemy did not expect permission to be ignored. By then, Eisenhower no longer needed confirmation. The Germans had told him everything through their actions. They had never been fighting Allied strength. They had been fighting fear of Patton.
Once across the Rhine, the German command structure fractured faster than Allied planners expected. This was not simply due to material inferiority. It was the cumulative effect of months spent reacting to a perceived threat that never followed a script. German headquarters repeatedly misidentified Third Army's axis of advance, shifting depleted formations to block movements that either had already passed or were never intended. Orders arrived too late. Counterattacks formed against empty ground. This paralysis confirmed Eisenhower's earlier observation. The Germans were not adapting to Allied operations, they were guessing. Montgomery's forces advanced steadily in the north, securing terrain methodically. Patton's formations, meanwhile, exploited confusion in depth, bypassing resistance rather than grinding through it. German generals were forced to choose where to fail. By the spring of 1945, fear had replaced planning, and once that happened, German resistance became fragmented, local, and ultimately ineffective.
In the aftermath, a question lingered, never officially asked, never officially answered. Could the war have ended sooner? Eisenhower understood why such questions were dangerous. Publicly acknowledging that one Allied commander exerted disproportionate psychological influence would have undermined coalition politics and post-war narratives. The alliance required shared victory, not comparative accounting. Fuel allocation decisions, operational pauses, and resource distribution were framed as logistical necessities. In reality, they also served to prevent political imbalance. Eisenhower's responsibility was not to maximize speed at any cost, but to ensure victory without fracture. History often judges outcomes, not constraints. Eisenhower accepted that future criticism was preferable to wartime collapse. What he did not deny, privately, was that German fear of Patton accelerated the enemy's breakdown far more than official reports ever admitted.
Reducing Montgomery to caricature misses the point Eisenhower grasped clearly. Montgomery was not ineffective. He was stabilizing. His deliberate style secured flanks, absorbed pressure, and reassured Allied governments that operations remained controlled. In coalition warfare, reassurance is a form of power. But reassurance does not unnerve the enemy. German commanders never believed Montgomery would move faster than their ability to respond. They believed Patton might, and so they planned accordingly. Eisenhower did not choose between them. He used both, one to hold the alliance together, the other to keep the enemy off balance. This balance, uncomfortable as it was, defined Allied command through the final months of the war. By April 1945, Eisenhower no longer needed intelligence summaries to understand the truth. The Germans had demonstrated it repeatedly. Warfare is not only about numbers, terrain, or equipment. It is about expectation, and expectation can be weaponized. Patton was not feared because he was invincible. He was feared because he violated assumptions. He acted outside the rhythm German generals relied upon to survive. Eisenhower learned that command is not always about control, but about knowing when to let uncertainty work in your favor.
This lesson would never appear in formal doctrine. It was too political, too personal, too destabilizing. But it shaped the final campaign all the same.
As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, organized resistance increasingly became symbolic rather than strategic. German units fought not to reverse the outcome, but to survive it. Reports reaching SHAEF showed the same pattern. Formations withdrew or surrendered in the face of Patton's Third Army more readily than elsewhere. This was not surrender to strength alone, it was surrender to inevitability. German officers described Patton's approach as relentless, not because of casualties inflicted, but because his units rarely paused. There was no rhythm to exploit, no predictable halt where negotiations or regrouping might occur. Montgomery's forces advanced with discipline and caution, securing vast numbers of prisoners methodically. Patton's advances dissolved formations before they could even organize a defense. By April, German command no longer believed it could shape the battlefield. It could only endure it. With Germany's surrender imminent, Eisenhower made a deliberate choice. He did not reshape the official narrative. Victory communiques emphasized Allied unity, coordinated planning, and collective achievement. Individual psychological advantages were excluded, not because they were untrue, but because they were inconvenient. Patton himself complicated matters. His public statements, political views, and disregard for diplomatic nuance made him an unsuitable symbol for post-war unity. Eisenhower understood that elevating Patton's role would create new fractures at the very moment peace demanded cohesion. So the insight remained private. The enemy had feared one man disproportionately, and that fear had been exploited quietly, without acknowledgement. History would record movements and dates. It would not record what the Germans thought while making their decisions.
After the war, intelligence files were sealed. Ultra remained classified for decades. German assessments of Allied commanders were buried in archives few would read. This was not conspiracy, it was policy. Nations emerging from total war prioritized stability over introspection, revealing how perception, fear, and individual personality shaped victory, risked undermining institutional legitimacy on both sides of the Atlantic. Critics would later ask whether lives were lost to preserve egos or alliances. Eisenhower never addressed such questions directly. His view was pragmatic. The war ended. Europe stabilized. The alliance held. Whether it could have ended sooner became a question history was not prepared to answer.
In the final accounting, Eisenhower did not deny Patton's value. He contextualized it. Patton was never the war. He was an instrument within it, used sparingly, constrained deliberately, and unleashed only when fear could do more than firepower. The Germans taught Eisenhower this lesson by their own behavior. Armies do not fight reality. They fight what they believe will happen next. Patton disrupted belief. Montgomery stabilized alliances. Eisenhower balanced both. That balance, not speed alone, ended the war. And the sentence Eisenhower never spoke publicly remains the documentary's quiet conclusion. The enemy feared unpredictability more than force.
When Germany surrendered, the war in Europe ended cleanly, but its explanations did not. The official narrative emphasized coordination, patience, and coalition discipline.
Eisenhower's public statements were carefully neutral. No commander was elevated above the alliance. No operational philosophy was singled out as decisive. Behind closed doors, however, Allied analysts began reviewing what had actually happened in the final months. The pattern was unmistakable. German resistance collapsed unevenly, not where Allied strength was greatest, but where uncertainty was highest. Eisenhower understood that victory required silence as much as explanation. Publicly dissecting why German generals feared one Allied commander more than another risked reopening wartime rivalries during fragile peace negotiations. So the war ended without clarification, and history inherited an incomplete picture.
In the years that followed, German generals began writing. Von Rundstedt, Guderian, Manteuffel. Their memoirs were defensive, selective, and often self-serving, but they revealed something Allied records did not. Again and again, Patton appeared not as a tactician to be countered, but as a problem to be anticipated. German authors described his movements as disruptive, unsettling, and operationally dangerous in ways they rarely applied to other Allied commanders. Montgomery was described respectfully but predictably. His offensives could be planned against, Patton's could not. These memoirs did not praise Patton, they explained fear of him. Eisenhower read these accounts privately. They confirmed what intelligence had already shown, but by then the narrative was set.
Military institutions favor lessons that can be taught. Logistics can be taught. Command structures can be taught. Coalition management can be taught. But psychological disruption driven by individual personality is difficult to formalize. Eisenhower's insight that enemy perception could outweigh numerical advantage did not fit neatly into doctrine manuals. It relied too heavily on context, character, and judgment, so the lesson remained implicit rather than explicit. Future wars would emphasize control, planning, and predictability, the very qualities German generals had once relied upon to survive. The uncomfortable truth that unpredictability could be decisive remained largely unspoken, not denied, just unrecorded.
Patton's death came suddenly, before reflection, before reconciliation, before historical balance could be publicly addressed. With him gone, there was no advocate for reinterpreting the final campaign through the lens of psychological warfare. No pressure to revisit decisions made quietly under wartime constraints. Eisenhower moved on to rebuilding Europe and eventually leading the United States. The alliance solidified, NATO formed, stability replaced analysis. By the time archives began opening decades later, the principal actors were gone. Context had faded. Debates became abstract. The truth survived, but without voices to insist upon it.
Looking back, the evidence aligns across sources. German generals concentrated forces not where Allied strength was greatest, but where uncertainty threatened their planning cycles. That uncertainty was Patton. Eisenhower did not worship it, he managed it. Montgomery provided predictability that held the alliance together. Patton supplied unpredictability that fractured the enemy. Victory required both. The Germans revealed this truth themselves, not through confession, but through fear-driven decisions that weakened their final defense. And that is the story history almost missed.
When historians later reconstructed the final 6 months of the war, they focused on movements, supply tonnage, and casualty figures. What they often missed was intent, how decisions were made under uncertainty. German operational logs show repeated reallocations of armor towards Third Army sectors, even when Allied strength elsewhere was objectively greater. This behavior makes little sense unless fear is considered a variable. Fear compressed German decision cycles. It forced premature redeployments. It caused units to defend against threats that had not yet materialized. Eisenhower did not need hindsight to see this. He recognized it as it unfolded and quietly adjusted. This was not favoritism, it was command judgment. The enemy was revealing its weakness through its own reactions.
After the war, Eisenhower had opportunities to reshape public understanding. He chose not to. Correcting the record would have required diminishing Montgomery's perceived effectiveness and elevating Patton's psychological impact. Neither served post-war stability. Britain needed its heroes. America needed unity. Europe needed reassurance. Eisenhower understood that peace demanded narrative discipline. History remembers him as a consensus builder because that was the role he embraced, even when it meant leaving operational truths unspoken. What mattered to Eisenhower was not who received credit, but that the alliance survived victory intact.
German generals respected Montgomery. They feared Patton. That distinction matters. Respect allows planning. Fear disrupts it. Montgomery's methodical approach reassured allies and stabilized fronts. Patton's unpredictability denied the enemy confidence in its own calculations. Both were necessary, but only one distorted German decision-making at the highest level. Eisenhower did not confuse admiration with effectiveness. He watched what the enemy did, not what it said. And what it did revealed everything.
No document records Eisenhower formally stating that German generals feared Patton more than Montgomery, but every operational response supports the conclusion. The absence of the sentence does not negate the reality behind it. Some truths are not written because writing them would cause more damage than silence. Eisenhower understood this. Leadership is not always about disclosure. Sometimes it is about restraint. In the end, World War II in Europe was not decided solely by numbers, industry, or firepower. It was shaped by belief. The Germans believed Patton might appear anywhere, at any time, without warning. That belief forced mistakes. Those mistakes accelerated collapse. Eisenhower recognized this and used it, quietly, carefully, without credit. This documentary is not about choosing sides between commanders. It is about understanding how fear can shape history, and why the most powerful weapons are sometimes the ones the enemy imagines, long before they ever arrive.
If you value historically grounded World War II documentaries like this, built from real records, real battles, and real decisions, please consider subscribing. Most people watching this channel are not subscribed, especially those watching on television. If that's you, subscribing now helps ensure these documentaries keep getting to you. On TV, you can subscribe by pressing the OK button on your remote. On mobile or desktop, the subscribe button is just below this video. New documentaries like this are released regularly. Thank you for watching.